Welcome back to The Current. This is Chris Nafis, pastor of Living Water Church, as most of you already know. And this week I'm coming at you from Point Loma Nazarene University, where I've been attending PALCON, which is a pastors and leadership conference in the Church of the Nazarene. It comes around every 4 years, I believe. And just had a good week here. And as I was here and knew that there was going to be a bunch of awesome people coming to the conference, I thought, I wonder if I could get somebody to come and join me for an interview on the podcast. And thankfully, Eric Paul, a friend of mine, was willing to come. Eric is an expert practitioner in the area of mediation, conflict, working through conflicts, peacemaking, justice, those sorts of things. And we had a great conversation about all of those things today. Hope that you enjoy it, find it edifying and meaningful. So here it is. Well, thanks for joining me. This is Eric Paul, everybody. He is the director of the West Hawaii Mediation Center, and he's also the coordinator of Justice and Compassion on the Hawaii District in the Church of the Nazarene. We've known each other, kind of just met this week at this conference that we're at, but we've kind of known each other online for a while. Eric reached out to me because we're like, there's certain people in the church or in the denomination that you're like, we should probably be friends because we do a lot of the same stuff and have a lot of the same interests, and so we've kind of struck up a kind of an online friendship. But thank you for being here, Eric.
It's so good to be here. Thanks for having me. And yeah, I think a lot of times this work, when we're doing peace and justice within the church, becomes pretty isolating, and it's hard to find your people. Yeah. And so, yeah, I'm always interested in connecting with those who have similar interests and be friends.
Yeah, for sure. I was really happy. I know you were a little tentative reaching out to me just in a random message on Facebook, but I was like so happy to receive a message. It was really, it was just meaningful to be like, yes, someone else is reaching out. And so, well, maybe just start. So this, I've mentioned this to you. This podcast is mainly aimed at discipleship, and we've been working slowly through the book of Acts, but I'm taking these little breaks to interview some of the people doing great work that I know. And I knew you were coming here, and I was like, this is PALCON. There's going to be people here. And I was like, Eric, he's the one that I'm going to try to grab at PALCON. So thank you for doing this. Maybe you can just share, who you are, what do you do, how'd you get into this work, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So my name is Eric Paul. I live in Kona on the Big Island of Hawaii. I serve as the executive director of a local nonprofit that does conflict resolution work. So our mission is simple. We help people resolve conflict. It's a little bit harder to do than it is to say.
That's what I found to be true.
Yes. But we do that at the Mediation Center with our community mediation work, which is both alongside the court system, but also for neighbors who find themselves stuck in relationships and need a little help moving forward. We do peer mediation work in West Hawaii schools, predominantly elementary and middle schools. And then we do restorative justice work, and particularly victim offender conferencing with kind of a partnership with the prosecutor's office, which is really unique when it comes to restorative justice in the United States. So yeah, that's some of the work that I do. And then I also work with the church. My wife and I are pastors, and we lead a house church in Kona. And I also serve as the coordinator for justice and compassion. I come alongside churches and help them discern the work of God in their communities.
Yeah, so cool. I mean, all that work is so interesting and good. I shared with you earlier, I got to dabble a little bit in my kind of figuring out my bivocational days in victim offender dialogue. Would you tell us a little bit about what that is? It's such an interesting approach it's such a refreshing approach to kind of the brokenness of crime and violence and, theft and the things that happen in our communities, and such a better way to address it than kind of the punitive things that we tend to see that many of our folks have experienced in the justice system.
Yeah. And I want to back up. And a lot of people ask me when I tell them that I'm the director of a mediation center, that I work with the court systems, that I've set up this kind of restorative justice partnership with the prosecutor's office. They say, so do you have a JD? Are you a lawyer? Do you have a law degree? What is your background in this? And I always tell them I kind of came to restorative justice work through kind of the back door of theology and Christian ministry. That is that I see the gospel of Jesus Christ as being restorative. That the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus moves us from death to life, from from woundedness and harm to healing. And when we look at what the gospel actually says about justice, we don't understand justice as punitive or disciplinary. We understand justice as healing. That if crime wounds, justice heals. But we don't have that in our criminal legal system right now. Right now, what we have in our criminal legal system, we ask questions like, to a person who committed a crime, did you break the law? What law was broken? And what do you deserve because that law was broken? Right. And it takes it out of a relationship context and places it before a law. So you're not accountable to the person who you harmed. You're accountable to the laws. Yeah. And it's very adversarial, where you're put against people, where a judge has to say you win and you lose. And restorative justice, the work that I do, is very different than that. It asks a different set of questions. It asks who was harmed, what needs were created because of that harm, and whose obligations is it to meet those needs. And that's a very different set of questions than what the criminal legal system asks. It's more relationship-centered. It centers the person who experienced that harm and allows them a voice to participate in that process.
Yeah, because a lot of times in criminal cases, like the actual victim has almost nothing to do with the case. They don't even know what's going on half the time. And so if we're really looking to restore sort of wholeness to the community, both on behalf of the victim and often on behalf of the person who's committed the crime, who needs to be sort of brought back into the community, hopefully at some point, there needs to be some kind of communication between the two and some kind of connection between sort of what happens and the consequences of the thing that's happened should be tied to that, you would think, right? But then it usually isn't. So, yeah.
Yeah. So I, in that work of what I've done with peace and reconciliation through biblical and theological foundations. I studied holiness theology of nonviolence, nonviolent social movements of change. I've studied peace building. Through all of that, I wanted a practical set of tools that I could use to address conflicts that happen in our communities and in our churches. And I realized very quickly in my pastoral ministry that I didn't have those tools. When I recognized that there was conflict and I tried to address it, I wasn't good at it. In fact, I caused probably more harm trying to address those conflicts because I didn't know what I was doing. And so I sought after trainings to be a mediator. I sought after trainings to do peace circle facilitation work. And in my role as the director of the local nonprofit, the Mediation Center, I had the opportunity to also learn victim offender conferencing, or what some people call restorative group conferencing. And so what we've done there is we've built a partnership with the prosecutor's office for predominantly pre-charge cases. So we have victim witness counselors in the prosecutor's office whose job it is to journey with victims of crime and to prepare them for what they're going to experience in the criminal legal system as their case moves through the prosecutor's office and towards a trial, which usually doesn't make it to a trial. 95% of cases don't make it to a trial. So when a person says, I'm waiting for my day in court, usually 95% of the time, that doesn't happen.
Yeah, the prosecutor is going to use whatever levers they have to kind of squeeze a plea deal, right or wrong, because the person who's been arrested, their life is on the line in some ways, like maybe not life and death in terms of like execution, but years of their life may be on the line. And so it's a lot hanging over you. It's a big risk to take if you're in that position, and prosecutors are pretty good at kind of twisting the screws on people.
So two things happen in that when we kind of move towards plea deals. One is it kind of lets the person who caused that harm off the hook. It allows them to say, oh, I didn't do this, but I'm going to plea down and say, this is what I'm actually guilty of. What does that do to a person who's experienced that harm?
Yeah. I mean, it belittles the thing that's happened to them, right? Yeah.
And then the second thing is it removes the opportunity for the person who experienced that harm to be able to share their story. Right. And that's one of the things that's really important for those who have experienced harm, wrongdoing, is a victim of crime, is they have questions that need to be answered. And they need to make sense of what's happened to them. And the person who is obligated, who's held accountable to that, is the person who's now taken a plea deal and is going to end up withdrawing from that relationship. Yeah. And there's not an opportunity to offer that kind of healing for the person who's experienced it.
Right. It's healing. And so I remember one of the cases that I got to be a part of was a burglary, a home invasion burglary. And I remember talking to the people who had been burgled, is that the word? I don't know. Someone had broken into their house, and for them, the person, they didn't know who it was. It was this big scary thing. They spent the rest of the months, I think it was over a year, just wondering, like, are they coming back? Who did this? It's this mysterious sort of dark force of people. Like, why did they target us? What, and all these big questions. And it turned out it was a bunch of dumb teenage kids that they didn't know who it was. It was a random thing. They were being dumb, and that doesn't take away from the harm that they caused. But it was so relieving, I think, for the victims in that case to be able to look eye to eye with one of the kids and say, okay, I understand who you are. I get to hear a bit of your story. You're not coming back for me. This isn't like some big mafia thing and they're going to, you know what I mean? Like your mind goes different places when you've been victimized and kind of traumatized and violated in that way. And so for the victims, it's like very helpful, I think, to be able to like look someone in the eye and share the harm and be a part of that.
Yeah. That's a great example of the work that I get to do and participate in.
That's so cool. And so the other thing I thought was pertinent for our folks, you've also been doing some work with like landlords and tenants. People, I think before evictions, you get in there and kind of work with some mediation. Well, what do you do there?
So what I will say that every state has different laws that kind of govern landlord-tenant relationships, and what's possible when it comes to landlord-tenant code. In Hawaii, after COVID, it became state law through what was called Act 57, that landlords were required to offer the option of mediation to their tenants before they could file a summary possession case in court. Okay. Now, to put that down to like layman's terms, landlords had to offer mediation before they could evict a tenant, before they could kick him out. And the way the state of Hawaii kind of managed that was that they paired mediation with recovery funds. Okay. So the CARES Act, through the federal government, infused the state with funds to be able to use for social needs that kind of arose from the pandemic. One of the biggest ones being for housing. Yeah. And so the Mediation Center saw all the eviction cases on the west side of Hawaii Island come through us. And so we sat down with landlords and tenants and came to an agreement, new agreements to keep tenants housed and landlords paid. And the way that worked was that those CARES funds were funneled from the state then down to local nonprofits who were managing them. And then those were dispersed not to the tenants, but directly to the landlords, which was one of the biggest issues that the landlords had, was they wanted to make sure that the money was going to them rather than to a tenant who could then use it for other purposes other than rent. Right.
Yeah, as a landlord, you go through this whole thing and then there's some resolution, but the money goes to the tenant. And if they just do the same thing and don't pay, then that's just going to create more harm. So, you can see where the landlords are coming from in that for sure.
Yes. And the studies that came out of that said that it definitely curbed the wave of evictions that we had anticipated and that the state had projected was going to happen because of COVID. With all the jobs and economic distress that had happened because of the pandemic, we were able to keep tenants housed and landlords were able to be paid.
I think in our work, so, where we're at the epicenter of homelessness, as you know, and everybody listening to this already knows. And one of the things that I've started paying attention to at the Regional Task Force on Homelessness in San Diego started publishing a report every month on how many people are being housed in the system and how many people are falling into homelessness or accessing services for the first time, which I still think they're undercounting because I don't think they're counting people who are accessing services again after falling out of their homes that they've been placed in. But for, I think it's 26 straight months now, that number has been a net negative, or however you want to look at it. There have been 200-300 more people falling into homelessness than getting out of it. Mm-hmm. And by the time someone gets to East Village, to the bottoms, to kind of where we are, things, it's so hard. I tell people, like, every step down, it's 10 times harder to get back out. And I really think some of the work needs to be done in preventing people from losing their housing to begin with. And I had never heard of landlord-tenant mediation that's like that's this way, that has like a restorative intent. It's such a cool idea, and maybe I'm just new to it because of my own ignorance, but feels like it could be really, really good work.
Yeah. Unfortunately, and I'll share honestly about this. That Act 57 lasted for 1 year.
Oh, man.
And then the House legislature allowed the law to lapse. And we worked to lobby for the law to come back, but they were willing to pay for mediation, but they weren't willing to pay for rental assistance. And in that particular bill, they were paired together. We weren't asking for much. We basically, of hundreds of millions of dollars in a state budget, we were asking for $12 million to do landlord-tenant mediation, and that would also come with rental assistance that would be paid directly to the landlord. They are willing to do the mediation side of things, but not the rental assistance side, and so it lapsed. Recently, we had a natural disaster. A disaster, tragedy in Maui, in the county of Maui. Yeah. And Lahaina and Kula were on fire, and hundreds of people lost their homes. And it's caused a lot of social and economic challenges for the county of Maui and the state. And so recently, the state legislature and the governor of Hawaii decided to do a landlord-tenant program for mediation and rental assistance, particularly for Maui. So now we have one in place for just that county. Okay. In the wake of the fires.
Man, it's so disappointing to hear when good programs like that get cut, because you're like, you're gonna pay that money one way or another. You can pay less now and avoid the hardship of like homelessness and eviction, or you can wait and pay it later when it's more visible or something, or more sexy. And it's disappointing. Seems consistent with politics that I've seen in my lifetime, though, unfortunately. Yeah. Well, so I want to, this is a church podcast, and one of your areas of expertise obviously is in the mediation of conflict. And I know that many churches have conflicts. Living Water, we just don't. We've never had any disagreement. No, I'm just kidding. We're a church full of people that have struggled in different areas of life. And I think even the most kind of cushy, comfortable people end up with conflicts all the time, right? I mean, conflict in some ways is a really healthy thing, because it means there's at least some level of honesty, and we have different thoughts, different habits. Conflict arises when people live near each other. How do you approach conflict? Like, how do you think about it? How do we work through it in healthy ways that are redemptive, that are rooted in sort of the teachings of Jesus? That's kind of a big question, but...
Yeah, and I'll just start by saying conflict is natural. Yeah. We are human beings, and because we are human beings in relationship, we are going to be in conflict with one another. In fact, conflict, oftentimes we see, because of the way we feel about conflict, when we're in it, it doesn't feel good. Right. And so it feels a little off in our bodies and our muscles and our minds and our hearts. It feels like our relationships are off, but they're not. And so we assume as Christians, when we're in conflict, there is sin. So conflict is sin. Mm-hmm. Conflict is not sin. That's right. Yeah. Conflict is a natural human dynamic, right? And usually it happens when a person's opinions or goals are frustrated by another person's opinions or goals. Mm-hmm. And that's going to happen because we are diverse, and we have carried different experiences, and we have different needs that we're trying to meet. And sometimes those bump up against each other. Yeah. But how we work through conflict matters. How we work through conflict could end up being sinful, yes. Could end up driving disconnection, could end up causing more harm, or conflict is an opportunity. And that's usually the lens that I choose to address conflict in. Is conflict is an opportunity to better know myself, to better know this relationship that's going on, to be able to express the needs that I have and what outcomes I want to see. It's an opportunity for growth. It's an opportunity for change. And when we get stuck in a relationship, it really helpful for me to see through that lens of, and even church dynamics, right? When churches get stuck in conflicts, and we're dealing with a bunch of them right now, of saying, okay, we're in this conflict, some stuff has gone down, how are we going to deal with it? How this is an opportunity for us to be able to talk through the issues at hand and do better next time.
Yeah, as you're talking, I'm like thinking of different conflicts, and like there's just so many different kinds of conflict too. Like some of the big church conflicts. I think the Hawaii district in the Nazarene church has struggled with some conflict recently, as has the Southern California district, and I think of that as one kind of conflict where there's different perspectives on something that's happened in the larger community, or in ideologies or those kinds of things. And I think about conflicts that happen like within our church, kind of interpersonal conflict on a small scale, like just people arguing with each other or fighting with each other, or wanting to box up the food in two different ways that we serve at our shelter, or getting frustrated because someone's volunteering but not helping as much as someone else thinks that they should be helping, and or those kinds of things. And there's often like power involved, and there's so many different kinds of conflict. Like, how do you find? I love the way of framing it as like an opportunity for a lot of things, but how do you find the opportunity in different kinds of conflict? How do you identify like what is the good that can come out of this?
Yeah, there are a couple of answers to that. I'll start first by just saying, peace and reconciliation work is not an addendum to the church's mission. It's not an add-on. It's not an extension. It's not something we do if we have time. Peacemaking is the mission of God and the vocation of God's people. Yeah. Throughout Scripture, both the Hebrew Scriptures and the Gospels and the epistles, we see a God that is reconciling all things to God's self. That's right. And that includes the relationships that we have with each other, the relationships that we have with God, the relationships that we have with creation. And all of those matter, and God wants those relationships to experience wholeness and healing and restoration. So that's first. That like grounds everything that I do.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for that.
And then the second thing that came to my mind is I'm a facilitator of listening spaces. Okay. So I create space for people to have conversations for change, dialogue for peaceful change, right? And one of the things that we don't do well as a church is listen. Listening is the first act of recognizing the humanity of others. Conflict has a way of creating fragmentation. It has a way of creating disconnection. When we're in conflict, our social reality is that we want to disconnect, we isolate, we withdraw. When we isolate and withdraw, then we start thinking up stories about what the other is thinking of us. Yeah. And so then we're making up stories that aren't true about what's happening in that conflict. Then we start to triangulate others into that experience with us. Well, I'm experiencing this with that person at my church, and now I'm going to go tell my best friend what I'm experiencing. So I'm bringing that person into the conflict as kind of what I justify as a support person for my needs. Right. But really what's often happening is I'm expanding that circle of conflict.
You're building your team.
I'm building my team. And then that fragmentation, that isolation, that disconnection is causing a higher group rift. And then we start thinking not just that we are different, but that we are better. And when we make that kind of cross between, when we bridge that I'm not just different, but I am better, then we get to that moment of it becomes really easy to dehumanize. And how we move away from that fragmentation and that dehumanization of the other is that we create spaces which a person can be heard. Yeah. Listening is that first step to reclaim the dignity of the other. Okay. And so when I mediate, when I facilitate, when I lead peace circle facilitations for groups in conflict, I'm trying to create a space in which people can have an opportunity to listen and have an opportunity to be heard. And that's one of the number one things that I get feedback on is that when people leave mediation, a lot of them express, I can't believe how much I just needed to be heard.
Just to have my needs kind of recognized and not just like heard, because I feel like we talk past each other during the conflict a lot, where people are actually talking a lot sometimes during, not always, but sometimes during conflict we're talking a lot at each other, but nothing's sinking in on the other side. Now oftentimes, I don't know how to ask this in the most helpful way, but there are times when someone is just sort of wrong, you know what I mean? Or someone has just done the wrong thing. And then there's a lot of times when someone just thinks that someone else has done the wrong thing and doesn't recognize their role in the conflict. But you know what I mean? Like sometimes someone has just, this maybe happens in some of the victim offender stuff. Someone has just wronged someone else. And, how do you facilitate like listening and opportunity as someone who feels like you have like clearly been wronged? You know what I mean? Like what's the first steps to someone who's like on that end of things trying to figure out how to address the conflict?
One is there's discernment in that. With a lot of conflicts are perceptions. Perceptions that I am right and you are wrong. Yeah. And I think everyone who's in conflict or ends up getting stuck in a relationship or a challenge feels as if they are in the right.
I mean, we all think we're right? Exactly. If I didn't think I was right, I would think something else.
But there are instances in which harm has been done.
Yeah.
And there are instances in which people don't want to be accountable to the harm that they've done. Yeah. One of the tenets of restorative justice work is that it centers the needs of the person who experienced harm. And I'm not going to move forward putting people in a room together in a face-to-face encounter unless that person who has experienced harm is volunteers to do that. That's what they want to do. And they've been coached and prepared in a way to enter that space. And sometimes that takes 1 session, 2 sessions, a couple of weeks, depends on the nature of the conflict and the harm. But I'm also not going to do it unless in clear-cut harm, wrongdoing, the other side that's involved, the other party that's involved, is willing to admit to it. Right. Because if that person isn't willing to admit to it, it can cause more harm to the person who has experienced it, right. Either through justifying the actions or brushing them aside as if the harm done is less than what that person has experienced. Then I'm not going to put that person in the room with that other person because it could cause more harm.
Right, because the denial of it, and then it just kind of resurfaces the same argument that may have already happened of you did this to me, what are you going to do about it? So, because, like I said, as when I was volunteering for victim offender dialogue and reconciliation, you have, in some ways you have the opportunity to be like, well, this isn't the right fit for this and we're not going to do it. Oftentimes in a church community, in any community really, there's not really the choice, if that makes sense. Like these two people are part of the same body, and maybe I'm one of the two people that's either being confronted or has done the wrong or feel like I've been wronged, or maybe I'm both of those things a lot of the times. Mm-hmm. But there's no real escape. Like the only way out is without dealing with the conflict is for someone to leave, which is often not the goal for church communities. What do you have suggestions for how we might, as a church community, not necessarily just as a pastor in the community, but like as just members of the community, how we can go about sort of encouraging a healthy dialogue around conflicts that arise? So say, we maybe, I don't know if you have a case study or something that you want to bring up, or just sort of a general path. Say someone feels like they've been wrong, someone's done something bad to them, they've talked bad about them. Because I think there's different conflicts. Some where someone's been wrong, or some where we just disagree about something. That's a different kind of conflict where it's more of an ideological thing. I'm talking about where someone feels like they've actually been hurt. What are the steps to start to heal from that?
Don't wait.
Don't wait. Okay. Yeah.
Conflict becomes more hardened over time.
Mm.
And the longer you wait to address something, the harder it is to heal from that. It's often said that the amount of time it takes to heal is the amount of time the conflict has taken. Okay. And so if you're in a conflict that's lasted a year, it's going to take time, right? So my first suggestion is deal with it as soon as possible. Okay. The first step in that, and I'm taking this directly from Matthew 18. Sure. Go to the person. Yeah. Address it. Don't bring anyone else in. Ask that and ask questions that are using I language, right? Don't accuse, don't blame, don't be judgmental. Keep it on your experience and your feelings. I felt this way when this happened. Mm-hmm. And I just want to make sure that our relationship is as it ought to be. Mm-hmm. I want to know, how do you feel about this? Did I wrong you in any way? And bring it up in a way that it invites them into a conversation, mm-hmm. rather than approaching it in a way in which blames and accuses. Because usually when you're feeling blamed or you're being accused or you're being judged, we put up our defensive postures, right. And we're less able to engage. So the language we use and the questions we ask matter, yeah. Right? So that's number one. Take care of it as soon as possible. Go to the person directly using nonviolent communication.
Which is really good advice for people like me. You know, like a lot of us are conflict averse, you know, and I'm like, I just like to be on good terms with everybody. And I'm even in denial myself oftentimes when I'm feeling like someone's, you know, when someone's really making me angry. A lot of times I spend like a week just thinking like, nah, I'm not really angry about this. But then eventually, you know, I'm like, no, this is not cool. That's going on, you know. And so I think, especially for, you know, because there's some people that are very quick to tell you what they think, and then there's some of us that really struggle with that. I think it is a good encouragement for us to say, well, this needs to be addressed. Like, you can't just like let it settle and hope that it disappears, because usually it's not going to just disappear on its own.
And I would also say, when I say take care of it as soon as possible, like address it as soon as possible, I don't mean in the heat of a moment, right. When you are angry and emotional and you're just saying whatever comes to the top of your head. No, give it some time to breathe, where you've come down, you've reflected on your own position and where you're at, what you need from this, right? Mm-hmm. You want to ask yourself, okay, what are the outcomes that I want from this conflict? What is it that I need in order to move forward? And become very clear on that. You can ask for that. Mm-hmm. These are what I need, but I can let go of some of these other things. And so taking that time for self-reflection, to calm down the emotions, to breathe in it, and then approach. You know, that for some people that takes 2 hours, right? For some people that's going to take a few days, right. But don't take months.
Yeah. Well, and because what it sounds like you're talking about. So, you know, for many in our church have gone through our flow groups now, which are groups aimed at, a lot of our group is about self-awareness and learning to understand your own body and your own response to conflict and trauma and trials and tribulations, and how, you know, when we get in this elevated state where we're kind of dysregulated and we're in this, you know, there's various postures you can get in, defensive postures or aggressive postures or just anxious postures. Like, that may not be the best time. So maybe you need to step away, like you're saying, get yourself settled, and come when you're able to like have a coherent conversation without losing, you know, control of your emotions again. Yeah. But there's a big difference between saying we need to deal with this now, 30 seconds after the thing happened, when you're all heated, and saying, we'll see if we're still upset about this in 2 months, you know, because that's not quite the same thing. So be smart about it.
The other, you know, Matthew 18 then goes on to say, if that person doesn't listen, mm-hmm. then bring 2 or 3 witnesses. Mm-hmm. You know, Matthew 18 is also the only, I think it's the only part in the Gospels in which Jesus uses the term ecclesia. Okay. Where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there the church is, right? That's the phrase that we like to say. And usually we like to isolate that, right. And say, oh, you know, we've got 3 of us here. Let's pray. Jesus will be with us.
It's in the context of conflict, though, that's...
But the whole chapter is about power, money, and conflict. Right. And so when Jesus is talking about 2 or 3 witnesses, when there are 2 or 3 gathered, that our posture is actually geared towards what Jesus's posture is, which is always a bent towards healing and reconciliation, of restoration of broken relationships. And so when you bring 2 or 3 witnesses, it isn't to blame, it isn't to accuse, it isn't to judge, it is to build listening spaces for the sake of healing. And if those 2 or 3 witnesses don't have that same bent as Jesus has, then they're not one of your 2 or 3 witnesses. They can support you, they can support your healing, but the bent is always towards that creating a listening space in which people have the opportunity to be heard and to be listened and to move towards healing.
Well, and going back to what you kind of started out with way back when we started this conversation, that the goals are maybe different than you might assume at the beginning. Because if you're coming to the conflict and you're saying, I need this person punished for something that happened, like that's not really the calling of Christ in the church. That's not the kind of community that we're meant to be, where like justice isn't defined by an evening of the scales. Justice is defined by sort of the future hope of wholeness and shalom, right? The future hope of peace. And if that's what we're looking for, if I can be, even with the person that I'm angry with or saddened by or hurt by, if I can have a posture towards them that's saying, I want what's best for all of us. Like I want us all, I want you to grow from this. I want to grow from this. I want this to be an opportunity for us to kind of deepen our connection and deepen our sense of peace together. Because, as many of us know just from experience, like if you've made it through conflict with people, then those bonds can get even stronger than they were before a lot of the times, because now you've been through something and that relationship has kind of been tested and it's held out.
You bring it, one of the things that just kind of came to my mind as you were talking was the things that are necessary in order to overcome harm and wrongdoing. And this goes from like broader nation state, like harm and wrongdoing when it comes to like apartheid or mass atrocities or something that would necessitate like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, right? TRCs kind of have a pocket of restorative justice within them. All the way down to like when an individual experiences conflict and harm or wrongdoing against them in a criminal sense, or even just a like brother and sister, right? But there are 3 things that need to happen in order to overcome harm and wrongdoing. The first is that the truth has to be acknowledged. And this is really, really important. We need to talk about what happened and hear the experiences of those impacted. But we also have to tell the truth of it. So the truth has to be acknowledged. The second is that equity needs to be restored. There needs to be reparative action. There needs to be a rebalancing of a power dynamic. There needs to be restitution. There needs to be a way to repair the harm that was done. The people who have the voice in that are the people impacted. And so the community is invited to the process. And this fits, again, within Matthew 18's model of 2 or 3 witnesses, but then the third step is bring it to the church. And that's not like a public forum in which you express someone's sins and wrongdoing behind the pulpit. That's not...
I should stop doing that.
Yeah, you should.
I usually just air everyone's dirty laundry on Sunday morning, so that's not good, you're saying.
Yes, that has never worked well. But we end up how do we create a space in which the people who experience that harm are able to express their needs and what they need in order to heal?
Yeah, I guess I would also add to that, because I think that the restorative action that you talked about, the equity, the part 2 of that, it's important for both the people who've been victimized, but it's also important for the person who has to make things right, to feel like, okay, I've done this thing and now I can call this complete. I've made amends, I've done the thing that was asked of me, and I can feel good about the fact that like I've taken this step that you probably didn't want to take at some point along the way, and like I've taken responsibility for my action and I can show it because I've done XYZ, and I can also trust that the person on the other side, they said if I do this, then we can call this resolved and we can sort of call peace, and I've done it, and so I can be confident in that.
And the word we have for that is accountability.
Yeah.
What we're talking about is true accountability, not accountability to, a law that was broken, or to the state, but to the person who has experienced the harm done. Yeah. To be obligated to meet those needs that that you caused. That is what accountability is to work to repair the harm that was done. And then the third step, so we have truth needs to be acknowledged, equity needs to be restored, and the third one is a plan to make sure it doesn't happen again. Future intentions need to be addressed. And this is literally a question when I work with groups in conflict is, how are you going to move forward now? How are you going to keep this from happening again? What is it that you need in order to move forward in a healthy way? Yeah. And so those future intentions to make sure that that harm doesn't repeat itself.
Which again is important for both sides so that the person who is maybe in the wrong in the situation can say, this is how I avoid this again. And then so the person who's maybe been victimized can trust that there is hope that this, because like, oh, if I forgive them, they're just going to do it again, especially if you move forward too quickly, it's just, cheap grace or whatever. And there's no actual hope of, you want to know that you're not going to get hit in the face again if you've been hit once. And I know we're going a little long on time. Hopefully you're okay. I'm good with it as long as you are. But have you seen, I'm kind of scared to ask this question because I don't know what it's going to obligate me and my congregation to do, if that makes sense. Have you seen churches that have done this in a systematized way well? I guess what I'm saying is, I feel like oftentimes we put these ideals out of how to deal with conflict or how to do this or that in terms of like discipleship. What should we do as a church? And then we just sort of trust people's individual sort of sense of desire to do this to kind of follow through on it. And I think a lot of times like there's got to be some established method, some path that can sort of facilitate this kind of reconciliation. And, church community is unique. It's often, our church is small. Most churches are small churches. And then we don't have like a criminal justice system that has prosecutors that are going to call the mediation. You know what I mean? Like, have you seen a church that kind of does this well, that's facilitated a culture of conflict resolution and restorative justice within the church? And you can say no, but.
I really want to say yes. I really want to say, yes, this church is doing this great. I think the answer is I haven't seen a Nazarene church do it. Okay. I have a house church. We do things a little bit differently. So we only have 4 families, which is small. And so the conflicts that we have often we're able to manage within the relationships that they occur. I use a modality, a tool, a process called circle processes. So peace circles for me are a really diverse, contextually adapt dialogical model. Which is really just a way of saying it's a way in which we talk to one another in an intentional way that I think really holds a lot of potential for the way in which we create a culture of peace within our congregations. They are a process that are really well suited for community building, repairing relationships, learning, increasing understanding, reconnecting people to one another, building trust, resolving conflict. You can use them just as a way to lead a Bible study. And so you get used to kind of the ebbs and flows of how a circle process works within a Bible study, within board meetings, within transition moments for the church with pastoral staff. But you can also use them in conflict situations. And they're my go-to for conflict work, especially with groups of between 8 and 20. Okay. You get over 20 people and you have to start kind of tweaking the model or using different models in a way that kind of intersect with one another. So you have to kind of discern how many people are in the room.
How many people are involved in this particular.
And that helps differentiate which dialogical tool you'll use.
You can't have too many people trying to talk at the same time, or if it takes an hour to go around the circle once, then that.
And in those situations, you can break off into multiple circles, and then have a spokesperson. You can do like a fishbowl where the most impacted by the conflict are in the center, and then the circle. There's a second circle around them, and then sometimes you can have people enter into the main talking circle, while the other circle is a hearing circle, right? So there are different ways to adapt it to more people. or in the situation that it calls for. So I tend to lean into peace circle processes as a tool that is really helpful for the church. And I've used it in church contexts often when I'm called to facilitate in these types of processes.
So what are like maybe in the, the elevator pitch version, what are the core tenets of like a peace circle process? Like what does that look like in a practical way?
Yeah. So the thing that makes a peace circle, there's kind of two elements. It is what it sounds like. You sit in a circle.
Like, can it be an oval?
Yeah, sometimes our shapes get kind of mismatched. But the other thing that makes a circle is everybody commits to the first guideline of the talking piece, to honor and respect the talking piece.
Which is like a physical thing that someone has in their hand to talk, like we've all done at camps or seen on TV.
Yeah, that you've done in second grade with your teacher who wants to be able to hear everyone's voice.
Here's the talking stick. Yeah.
Yep. It works for second graders, but it also works for adults. Yeah. And it is a way to regulate an intentional conversation. It oftentimes has a way of tamping down the people who talk too much and raising up the voices who don't have the opportunity to talk as much. So it creates that kind of equity and parity in voice to be able to both listen and to be able to have an opportunity to share. The group decides on the guidelines. The only one that I, as a facilitator, will say you have to follow this is honor the talking piece. But the other guidelines are created by the people who are participating. So what is it that you need in order to stay in this circle? What is it that you need from others in order to have a healthy conversation? What does that look like? What values do we need to hold on to for you to feel safe enough to share? And that is we start every circle with that conversation. We build connection first before we even talk about the issues.
And for those of you who have been part of our flow groups, like we make our agreements, right? We spend 2 or 3 weeks just kind of setting the ground rules as a group, just defining what they are ourselves. The facilitators don't bring that to the group. It's something that the group kind of self decides. And it's not, groups aren't in the context of conflict, but it's the same kind of thing where we're trying to build trust, right? And you're trying to build a sense of where everybody gets to voice like what they need from this group at this time, and then everybody else kind of agrees to honor that need and that request.
Yeah, and I'll often say change happens at the speed of trust. Change happens at the speed of trust, which is why in conflict situations, I'll sometimes spend maybe a couple days preparing people for a circle, but I've also spent weeks preparing people for a circle because I'm not going to get them in a room together until they've built mostly enough. They're not going to trust. If you're in conflict, you're probably not going to trust that person yet. Right. But if I can build up enough reservoir of trust in me as a facilitator to hold that space for you, then it's possible.
Yeah. I mean, that's part of the role of the facilitator, the mediator, right? Is to be the trusted the person that both people trust, even if they can't trust each other. Man, good stuff. I'm a little noting the time here, so I want to kind of wrap it up. One thing that's kind of come to mind for me as we've been talking is, I don't know if it's just been as we've been talking, but we're going through the book of Acts in this study, and there's actually a lot of conflict in the book of Acts. We'll see, Paul restored after he's, trying to kill the people, and they welcome him in. We see conflict over what to do about Gentile inclusion. We see conflict as people in Jerusalem reject particular people, and there's conflict. And someone said this at another of the workshops that I was at this conference, talking about trauma, how much of the scriptures are written from a context of trauma or written about traumatic incidents. And I think the same really is true of conflict, that so much of the things that we have in our Bible is about people who are in conflict with one another, in conflict with God, in conflict with themselves. And so, as Eric said earlier, like this really is the core work of the church. I mean, this is the core work of the human experience, being a people of righteousness, which, the word also means a people of justice. And again, if we understand what that means in building peace and shalom and finding that wholeness together as a community, not just for myself, but for us together, then this really is like core work that we do in the church. And if you pay attention in the scripture, you'll find that core work happening all throughout the scripture, as Eric said earlier. Any closing thoughts? Anything that we didn't talk about that you really want to share?
The only thing that I'll say, we're in a kind of a cultural moment of divisiveness.
Divisiveness? What?
Increasing polarization. What's the word we want to use? Disconnection. We seem to really be pulling against each other these days.
And there's a lack of trust that comes with this. And if change moves at the pace of trust, then we're going to be moving slow.
And here's what I know: many Nazarene churches are experiencing that fragmentation, that disconnection. But I also know many pastors who lament that disconnection. And many Nazarene churches are searching for ways to bridge divides, to drive connection, and to create spaces for understanding and reconciliation. I know that is happening. And we need to create opportunities for conversations for peaceful change. And that's hard work. It's long work. It needs to be funded work. It needs dollars behind it. You don't get people who are able to do that kind of work without resourcing them to do it.
That's right.
And we need people in our church who are able to be able to carry that. And we need churches to be agents of reconciliation, to be ambassadors of Christ's peace in the world.
Yeah. And just a thought on that. I don't know that I have any resolution to this. I don't know if you have any words of wisdom towards it, but I think especially with the political divide and we're heading into the heart of election season, like it's starting to be where every bit of the morning news that I hear or look at is about the presidential election coming up. And it's gotten kind of wild here in the last couple of weeks. It feels a lot of churches are divided by this partisan thing that is so much bigger than any of our communities. And I think that's part of the frustrating thing, is that like this fracturedness is coming from outside of our little community. And so even if we love one another and are tightly knit with one another, the conversation that's bigger than our group is kind of making its way in kind of like piercing the sort of the sanctity of our community. And it feels very overwhelming and like hard to control, because the divide and the ideological pushes and even the way that people are framing conversations, it's not like I can't stop folks from like hearing, I can't even stop myself from hearing the news with a certain slant or with a certain sort of demonization of the other side. And it feels like it's this thing that's so much bigger than us. So how can we stop the momentum of this divide? I think we have to learn how to live in it well together. And I think that's kind of what I hear you calling us to do within the church, is to be an example of people who can hold tension together, who can work through our differences, and who are willing to like do the hard work of talking through the ways that we hurt one another, even if those hurts are through pushes for political pushes or ideological pushes, and that's a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to do. So I guess I want to kind of acknowledge that before we close. I don't know. You can respond to that if you want, or you don't have to. But
I mean, there's so much there. We'd end up talking for 30 more minutes. I'll just say this: we tend to give ourselves over to stories that are not true.
Yeah.
And if we find our identity more in the identity of being a Republican or a Democrat, or our identity as being American more than we find our identity in the baptism of Jesus Christ, then we are not faithful.
Well, thank you. I'll let that be the closing word. And thank you so much, Eric. I really appreciate you coming on. And it's just been really great to get to know you, put a face to the name. And hope this is edifying for everyone in and around our church that's a part of this. We will catch you next time, hopefully. Don't forget to, share this if you want to. We haven't really advertised this podcast at all, but we're getting to the point where it's not terrible, hopefully. And so if you want to share it with somebody, share it, subscribe to it, like it. Give me some feedback, as I've been asking in every episode. Let me know how we're doing. And we'll see you next time. Thanks, Eric.
Thanks so much for having me. Aloha.